There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
It's 1926 and Sydney's underworld is held tightly in the hands of Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine. But down in Melbourne, they've got a fella called Joseph Theodore Leslie Taylor running the show, or Squizzy as he was better known. Squizzy Taylor is a bona fide gangster in every sense, and he's backed up by a handful of savage henchmen and crooks known as the Fitzroy Gang. Norman Brune is one of Squizzy's closest confidants. Well, he was. Until he crossed him. Usually a betrayal of the Kingpin would cost you your life. But Norman Brune had been spared under one condition: that he get the hell out of Melbourne quick smart and never ever return. So Norman, his wife and their two sons pack up and head north to Sydney. A fresh start, he thinks. This man is a hardened gangster, a standover man, a thief, a pimp, and he doesn't think much of two women running the streets of Sydney. Norman thinks he can shake things up around Darlinghurst. He wants to take a slice of the pie that in his mind has been in the wrong hands for too long. It doesn't take him long to assemble a crew of villains, a gang who would roam the streets of East Sydney carrying not guns to intimidate their enemies, but cut-throat razors, sharp enough to cause serious damage to anyone caught on the wrong side of Norman Brune or one of his boys. Not only are these razors serious weapons, they're a cheap and easy way to protect yourself and fly under the radar of police, who are busy targeting mobsters carrying illegal firearms. Momentarily, life will get more difficult for Tilly and Kate under the disruption their new Victorian competitor brings. But Norman Brune is about to bite off more than he can chew. Kate and Tilly are already in a never-ending battle to dominate Darlinghurst and its surrounds. This town, it just ain't big enough for the three of them. In a few short months, Norman Brune will be dead. And it will be just the beginning of bloodshed between East Sydney's cruelest and most cunning gangsters. This is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. My name is Emma Gillespie, and this month we're examining the life and crimes of Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine, and the razor wars that turned the streets of Darlinghurst blood red under their reign in the 1920s and 30s. On the last episode, we learnt about how Kate Leigh transformed herself from a wayward girl in juvenile detention to become an underworld matriarch of East Sydney, the queen of sly grog and, as the tabloids of the day called her, the worst woman in Sydney. We've heard how the now affluent and sought-after inner-city suburbs of Darlinghurst, Surrey Hills, Potts Point and Woolloomooloo were once the slums of the working class. Factory workers filled the streets by day, sex workers by night. The trade of illegal cocaine and alcohol was rife, and where the no booze after 6 rule was flouted each day to excess. On this episode, we'll learn how Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine's rivalry went from prickly feud to all-out war. Welcome to Razorhurst. I'm speaking with Dr. Lee Straw and journalist and author Larry Reiter to learn more about the Sly Grog matriarch, the brothel queen, and their razor gangs. Lee is an academic, historian and writer of The Worst Woman in Sydney, a biography of Kate Leigh, and Larry wrote Razor, the book that would go on to inspire a critically acclaimed season of the Aussie crime drama Underbelly. The Sly Grog business emerged after 1916, when pubs were ordered to shut at 6 p.m, thanks to outcry within conservative Christian groups about returned World War I soldiers drinking the city dry. Kate Leigh saw a business opportunity and she moved fast after a stint in jail to take advantage. Soon enough, by the mid-1920s, there wasn't a butcher shop or a florist front around Darlinghurst where you couldn't find some bootleg liquor after dark. And as Lee Straw explains, it's also a time when cocaine use changed.
You could go to the dentist with toothache and they would apply a little bit of cocaine. And remarkably, you didn't feel the toothache at all, which is, people were quite happy with that. There was this misguided belief that came through for the late 19th century that cocaine was not addictive, that you could take small amounts of it and you wouldn't become addicted. It's become increasingly obvious by the 1920s that, in fact, yes, people were becoming addicted to cocaine. So there's the issues around whether or not you can become addicted. But the other part of it is that you've got people like Kate Leigh that are paying chemists to get them some cocaine. They pay for that and then they sell that on the streets. So the police had to step in and limit that because that then creates issues. Once the drugs are on the streets, the police start to lose control of the distribution of that, and it then becomes a serious social issue.
By that point, Tilly and Kate were far from friends, but a petty rivalry was about to ramp up.
Then what happens is that they both get involved in cocaine. And once they get involved in cocaine in the 1920s, that then increases these organised crime outfits. And then they have their gangs to support the business and they become rival gangs. So you've got two very powerful women with their standover men, with the women and the men that work for them, who are competing in the same territory. And so it erupts in violence in the late 1920s.
Tilly and Kate's feud, it's folklore as we know it. But is cocaine where it began, or is it true that Tilly stole Kate's Pomeranian?
Yeah, sure. There's that story that certainly we told. Larry and others have told that great story. Yes, I have heard that story that she stole a dog. Then there's also the stories that, Tilly was parading in front of the press photographers with 2 Pomeranians showing off her new dog. So Kate went out and bought 3, just so she had one more dog than Tilly. There was partly that rivalry, but I think it really was set in the fact that you've got 2 very strong businesswomen who are in the same areas and they are competitors.
Tilly had Pomeranians and Kate had one, and she claimed that Tilly had stolen hers. And Tilly, in fact, wrote a letter to the newspaper that I have denying that she'd taken the dog and that why would she take one of Kate Leigh's dogs, because it wouldn't have fitted in with her special breed of Pomeranians and she wouldn't have wanted one of Kate's low-rent dogs anyway. I could read out the letter if you wanted it.
I would love that if you've got it somewhere handy.
All right, I'll just read you this little passage. Kate Leigh lies. They are my dogs. I have their pedigree and they are a class above hers. I don't wish to know her class. Kate Leigh, that thing of a virago. She is jealous of my youth and prosperity. I know too much for her, and that's why she hates me. Well, I think myself a class above her. The underworld all take their hats off to me and class me as a lady beside her. Why is it she can do as she likes? She's handy for the police, that's why. She's the biggest police informer in Australia.
Now, while Kate and Tilly were fighting over Pomeranians, I want you to take me south. Let's go to Melbourne. Who is Squizzy Taylor and why did he want Norman Brun to leave Victoria and never come back?
Well, Squizzy Taylor was the dominant gangster in Melbourne, and he had been up to Sydney early on and didn't like Sydney and returned to Melbourne and continued to commit crimes. He was into drugs, he was into robbery, standover tactics, all of that. And he was sort of a folk hero because he was tiny. He was a tiny fellow and a James Cagney-esque sort of fellow. And Norman Brun was in his gang at that time. And they had a falling out. And Norman came to Sydney because he'd heard from Squizzy that crime in Sydney was run by 2 women. And Norman thought, wow, how easy is this going to be? I'm going to go up there with my razor gang. And he assembled this group of 3 other villains, came to Sydney and started to make life difficult for Tilly and Kate. They approached them and they said, look, unless you pay us money, we're going to burn your premises, we're going to destroy everything inside them and so forth. And so this went on for a short time and Norman was drunk one night up in Charlotte Lane, which is not far from the Sydney Museum. And someone stepped out of the shadows and shot him dead in the street. And no one ever was arrested and charged with the crime. But people assume, and the police that I spoke to, many of whom were still alive when I was researching Razor back in the 1990s, they all said, yes, it was probably Frankie Green, who was working for both Tilly and Kate and was a known hitman and had murdered various other people. So the word on the street was that it was Frank Green as well who killed Norman Brun. And then after that, his gang dissipated. Snowy Cutmore, which is a great name for a razor gangster, Snowy went back to Melbourne to rejoin Squizzy Taylor's gang, but they had a falling out and they shot each other dead in a shootout in Squizzy's house. So that was the end of Squizzy and of Snowy.
Norman Bruin was another opportunist, okay? So he's down in Melbourne, as you say. He's looking for a bigger city at the time. He wants to extend his wealth. He wants to extend his reputation. You don't get these kind of characters without them having a massive ego. And Norman certainly had a pretty sizable ego. He is watching through the newspapers, through his contacts, through people traveling between Sydney and Melbourne. He's watching and he's listening to what's happening in Sydney. So he decides that there's an opportunity for him. A couple of women are running the business. That shouldn't be a problem. That's only 2 women running it. He can go in there. He can sort of schmoozy himself into organised crime in Sydney, but he didn't bet on the likes of Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine. They did not want Norman stepping into their business. They had their stronghold on it and there was no room for anybody else. So he makes a decision to try initially to work with the 2 rival gangs, but it just doesn't turn out well. And it certainly doesn't turn out well for Norman Bruin.
What became of Norman Bruin and his gang?
He was a standover man, mostly associated, I guess, with Tilly Devine, okay? And so that immediately put him on the back foot with Kate Leigh. There's a whole rivalry that's there. It's not just the rivalry with Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine. It's the fact that he's also got a rivalry with Squizzy Taylor, who was back in Melbourne as well, who dabbled a little bit in the Sydney underworld. But here's a guy who's a part of the Fitzroy gang in Melbourne. He then goes up to Sydney and he's working for Tilly Devine. And essentially what he's trying to do is to, as I said before, he's trying to make a big name for himself, but there's already big names that are there. But he, in fact, is gunned down. That's the end of Norman Bruin, is that he is killed in a shooting in Charlotte Lane in Darlinghurst at the age of 34. So pretty young to be a casualty of the Razor Wars, but he's one of the most significant casualties of those Razor Wars.
Why razors? Was the razor a choice of weapon prior to this time in Darlinghurst, or was that a newer tactic?
No, it was a tactic which again was the result of one of these laws. A lot of servicemen, when the war was over and they returned, they kept their service revolvers. And so there was a lot of guns around Sydney. And increasingly, as times got tough, these guns were being used to hold people up, as weapons. And to stop that, they decided to ban all handguns. If you were caught with a handgun, it was a lengthy prison term. So to get around that, and I guess to have a symbol of menace, the gangsters started carrying these cutthroat razors, the razors that open up and close, and it's got a long blade and like a bone handle, and it folds in upon itself, and you can carry it in your jacket, and if the policeman stops you, you can say, "Honest officer, I was just going home to have a shave." And that was a symbol of menace in Sydney. All the gangsters carried them. And if you look at Peter Doyle's wonderful compendiums of mugshots, so many of the villains in the police mugshots of the 1920s and early 30s carry this scar. It's vertical down the left-hand side of the face and horizontal across the mouth. And that was the sign that someone had been attacked by a razor gangster. Officially there was about 500 recorded cases of razors being used to attack people. But that's just the tip of the iceberg because gangsters didn't tell on each other. They would never say who had attacked them. And there were a lot of domestic razor violence as well.
So there are a few advantages to the razor then. We know it can be carried on a person easily. It's not breaking any laws having it on you. You leave a branding essentially on your victim.
Yes.
And you can easily cut someone, is this correct? And they could bleed and bleed and bleed because of the amount of vessels in the face?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you were to cut someone on the throat, they would die. They'd bleed out or on a vein or something like that. But it was symbolic. It was symbolic of danger and menace. And, one of the policemen said, there's no scarier thing than to see a cutthroat razor glinting in the light of a street light. That sort of thing. So it did have a scary aspect.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with razor author Larry Ryder and historian and author Lee Straw about Kate Leigh, Tilly Devine and the Razor Wars of Darlinghurst. What strikes me about this time and the Razor Wars is how violent and brutal some of those battles were, but that murder did seem more rare, that it was more about menace and intimidation and gang warfare and cementing your status as, you know, whoever was on top on that day on that street. Why was that?
It was very rare for a member of the public to get hurt in these razor wars or the gangster wars, but it did happen. Big Jim Devine shot 2 people dead from the veranda of his house in Torrington Road, Maroubra. I think about 6 people actually died in the wars as a result of fighting, but a number were slashed. Compared to what's happening in, you know, with the Hamsies and the Alameddines at the moment in Sydney, it's nothing. It's compared to what's happening today. I mean, a lot more people have been killed in those wars, but I guess, again, the public are reasonably safe unless they walk into a stray bullet.
What was the message being sent when the Razor Wars targeted female victims such as Tilly's sex workers, Kate's female employers, you know, women who were essentially pawns in this bigger picture? Was that a new tack for these gangs?
Yes, it was. They tried to coerce people to abandon Tilly's operation and go somewhere else, or to sell Sly Grog in competition to Kate. And Kate and Tilly came down very hard on these people. And sometimes the women were used as pawns. And that was a new thing, because the fact of women being attacked only happened when these things became crimes after the enactment of the laws. So yes, it was new and it was shocking. And no woman was actually killed, though. I mean, someone like Nellie Cameron was shot many times, but she didn't die of her wounds. But when she finally did die, they found bullets in her body that were still floating around there. So yes, there was outrage, but it kind of came with the territory, which sounds a very cold thing to say. But that was the world, that it's prostitution, which involves women. So it was kind of, there was an aspect of people, if they get involved in those things, well then, if they get hurt, it's collateral damage.
So Norman Broome is out of the picture, but the Razor Wars are far from over. What happens next?
Peace was restored after Norman Broome was sent off. They were left alone to take care of their own businesses. But there was still animosity. If one of Tilly's gang members, or if Tilly's gang's walking down Kellett Street or William Street or something, and they run into a group of people who are allied to Kate, there would be insults hurled and there would probably be violence, I'd say. In 1929, which is a good 2 years after Norman Broome was murdered, there was the Kellett Street riot on the 8th of August 1929 in Kellett Street in the Cross, you know, the street just behind Bayswater Road. And the gangs had gathered there in the day. It was a freezing day. They'd gathered on either side of the street and they were just hurling insults at each other. And as the cocaine and the booze took effect later on into the night, someone threw a brick. A guy called Ben Drott, who was an author living in Kellett Street, yelled out for them, "Please be quiet down there, I'm trying to work." And someone fired a gun that bounced off the wall, which was the signal for the 2 gangs, who were about 40 men, who just attacked each other. And it was a furious battle, fought with razors, bricks, bottles, guns, whatever. It lasted half an hour. The police knew about it, but felt that they weren't able to control it, so they just let it peter itself out. And it's commemorated today on the corner of Kellett and Bayswater Road. There's a plaque in the footpath that commemorates the Kellett Street riot of 1929. So, yes, there was animosity, and sometimes the gangsters changed sides. If Tilly decided to make an offer to someone like Frankie Green, who was a very, very feared gunman, or perhaps Guido Coletti, who was another gangster, fell in love with Nellie Cameron, who was working with Tilly Devine, he would defect from Kate's employment to Tilly's. So it was a bit of a movable feast with the gangs, but they were loyal to whoever was paying them, and they would do what was required of them.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the value of hindsight where you could see where things were going, but the police at the time are trying to do the best that they absolutely can when there is escalating violence on the streets of Eastern Sydney. So Darlinghurst ends up going to becoming Razorhurst because the police are making a keen note of gun violence. So guns were a real problem in the 1920s, okay? You've got Norman Broome, you've got others who are gunned down in Eastern Sydney. And so the police are making the decision to say, we need to control guns. We need to bring in legislation that means that you can't carry a gun without a proper license. And even then, there's strict restrictions in place in relation to that. So the crooks can't use guns, and they certainly can't carry a gun. So that changing legislation means that the crooks then turn to using razors, because you can obviously hide a razor in your clothing. It's not as obvious as a gun, and you can pull a razor out pretty quickly. The real problem with razors, as we know, is it is extreme violence. It is very personal. A gun, there's a level of distance from the victim. But with the razors, you're right up at a person, and it's very physical, it's very violent, and it was just horrific. Some of the injuries of people who survived, there were women who worked in the prostitution business and got entangled in the rivalry, and the kind of scars that they carried the rest of their lives, huge cuts from the lips up the cheeks to sometimes there were some women who had a scar straight up to the eyebrow at its tip as well. Really horrific injuries that were suffered. But this became, as I say, even more of a problem because of the very close physical nature of that kind of violence.
Next time on True Crime Conversations, Lee Straw and Larry Ryder describe the fallout across Darlinghurst as the razor wars came to a head. How did police fight to take back control? And what happened at the Battle of Blood Alley? True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast produced by Gia Moylan. I'm Emma Gillespie, and I'll be back next week for the finale in our 4-part series on the razor gangs of East Sydney and the crime queens at the centre of them, Tilly Devine and Kate Lee.